the Bible, God's good book, God's book of books, the first book in his book of books, cuts straight through the inflation of human nonsense. You see, atoms is what the Bible calls us sapiens, human beings. There's one thing that we need more than anything else, and that's friends. The best friend that an atom like us can have is God. And God's story about Abraham and Sarah, well, it's about you and me making friends with God, just like them. Genesis chapter 12 to 25 is the Abrahamic story, and the Bible never lets go of the story of Abraham. It's important from beginning to end. And it's like an episode of Friends, the one with God. So come on in, let's check it out together. Right on, welcome to the Biblical Channel. So glad you're here because, hey, we like talking about God, and we assume that you like talking about God, and we think that the best thing that we can do is start talking about God. And talking about God means, well, talking about what God says and getting the story right. And so we just want everybody to be able to read their Bibles better, to read it with the same perspective that the author, God himself, expected these words to be written from. And I think it would surprise us to know that the Bible expects to be read with great joy, to be read from the perspective of liking God, and that it's actually not even, possible, but it's guaranteed that you can be in a relationship of liking God. So anyhow, what we try to do here is just try to make sense of the text in a, modern day world, but these old stories, they cut us like a knife in a very, very good way. They kind of give us a circumcision of our hearts so that we think straight. Well, anyhow, we're going to take a look at Genesis chapter 12 to 25, the whole story of Abraham in a highlight reel of sorts. So it's going to take us, a short time to get there, but we're going to get it done. So anyhow, Genesis 12 to 25, we can't read it all, so we're going to have to read some stuff along the way, and then we'll talk about it. And so before we do anything like that, let's just pray the way the Lord Jesus taught us how to pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And that's the rub. Deliver us from evil, Lord. Cut away the fleshliness of our hearts so that we might enjoy the friendship that you would like to enjoy with us. Okay, Lord, here we go. Genesis chapter 12. We just have to really start out with repeating that Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 to 3, and maybe we'll go down to verse 5. But the context is this. The Lord says to Abraham, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I'll make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. Well, there we go. This is a story, we must admit, that seems a bit on the ordinary side. There is absolutely nothing that, seems to stand out in neon lights, but it does. And here's why it does. It does because it's ironic that this seems like a story of a couple of nobodies. And it is. And that's exactly the way that God wants this story. A couple of nobodies is a perfect beginning for an epic story of God's own making. You see, the world expects flash and glitz and glamour and big bangs. But God says that's not my way. God's heroes in the Bible, starting with Abraham and Sarah, and really all of them, beforehand as well, they really didn't see anything very special in themselves, which, maybe I'll take a commercial break here and give a note on real heroes. Real heroes, when I say real heroes, I mean like Medal of Honor heroes. And I've worked with Medal of Honor heroes with their program in bringing character traits to kids, etc., in a classroom. And I've met a few Medal of Honor heroes. And I've watched so many of their videos telling their own story. And what is absolutely remarkable about the Medal of Honor heroes is they all say this one very thing, that they're not superheroes. They're not even extraordinary. They're not even sensational. They're not even strong. They simply rose to the occasion that was in front of them. And they truly feel like anybody and everybody could have done it. Nothing melts my heart more than somebody who has that perspective. That perspective that I'm not a hero. I just did what was right in front of me, and it was the right thing to do. You see, God's heroes are actually the forgotten men and women of the world. The forgettables. Let's just call them the forgettables. When a category of people become the world's forgettables, you can bet your life that God is super interested in who the world thinks are just simply forgettable. Forgettable to the world, but not to God. And that's the way this story unfolds. Abe and Sara are a couple of forgettables. And if Abe and Sara are special to God, then the message of this story is, then you are too. Because they are ordinary. There is truly nothing special about them, except that, well, God sees them as special. And God doesn't change his mind when it comes to the ordinary people like me and you. The world's heroes, the modern world, the ancient world, no matter where we are in space and time, the world's heroes are quite frankly hypocritical because they're unrealistic and they're unrelatable. When you think about the big ancient epics like Gilgamesh and Achilles and Odysseus, they're half gods. I'm not a half god. You a half god? I'm not a half god. So I just simply can't relate to a story of a half god. You know what I'm saying? And when I really delve into their lives and their stories, it's kind of fun, and there's lessons I suppose to be learned, but it's not me. And I can't jump into that story with my own imagination. And even when we get to, silly philosophers like Nietzsche, who, espouse a Superman of sorts, it's still unrealistic and it's still unrelatable. I'm not a Superman. And I don't meet people who are super people. I meet people who are just people. I have yet to meet a super people of any kind, really. And then, think about a more modern, heroes, the Marvel action series. Nothing is more unrealistic and unrelatable. There's no movie that puts me to sleep faster than a Marvel action hero movie. Ask my kids, ask my family. As soon as we sit down to watch a new one, I'm out. But, the world has an inconsistency or a hypocrisy on this. But then the world also blames God and the Bible, Christians, even Jews, for being hypocritical in an area too. Because the world hears the message and sees the impact of the Christian or even the Jew. And they see this insistence of the Christian, especially, on humility. But they also see the insistence on the Christian for being earthly successful. And so the people around us, the fun suckers of this world, cry foul, and they say, you can't be humble and be earthly successful at the same time. You cannot hold those two values up at the same time. And God says, oh, yes, you can. In fact, true earthly success that endures is actually success found in the humble, in those who understand what humility is. And the Bible also turns bravery on its head, and we should understand this as well, that bravery is really only possible for the weak or the meek. Because by definition, if you are the strong and you defeat the weak, well, then you're just a bully. And if you're the strong and you're just picking fights with the others who are strong, well, then you're just in a competition. The whole idea of being brave is really a category reserved only for the weak and for the meek. And when you start to understand that, you're starting to understand how God is operating in his story and how God is operating his message for the ordinary people, the people that are considered, well, too humble, too concerned about humility, who are challenged, to be inconsistent, that you are not supposed to be earthly successful if you at the same time claim to be humble. But it's the world that doesn't understand these things. The world is just simply ignorant of the ways of God. The world finds this stuff unbelievable. And the world continues to insist that, heroes are supernatural. And if heroes are supernatural, then that means they're better than us. And if there are heroes that are supernatural and better than us, well, then that means us forgettables should just simply kiss their feet and do whatever they tell us to do. That is not the way of God. God gives us heroes that are just like us so that we can be just like them, friends with God. If you are friends with God, then you truly are one of God's heroes for this world. And Abe and Sara and Lot, they're not extraordinary, but they're ordinary. And they're so ordinary that you can almost forget them immediately. However, in the ordinary is where you find the extraordinary. And yes, God's story here with Abraham in chapter 12 to 25, it's a good story. It's got danger, it's got conflict, it's got intrigue, it's got suspense and irony and rescue. But at the same time, from the world's standards of Marvel Comics and Gilgamesh epics and everything in between, it's a bit of a yawn. And it almost seems like there's nothing in there for us, except that there is everything in there for us, because God's realistic and God's into real people who are ordinary people. And from God's perspective, we are all ordinary people. He understands us better than we understand ourselves. So let's just take a look at this story of Abraham and Sarah and Lot. And let's just get the highlight reel, so to speak. Let's do a quick journey through Genesis chapter 12 through 25. We'll read a little bit along the way and talk about it. That's the way that we'll go about it. And I got to tell you that, whenever I was, I think it was about 28 years old, when I was on the verge of becoming a Christian. And, in order to be a Christian, I thought, well, I better read this Bible, which is hilarious because I couldn't really read that well. And that's a whole nother story for a whole nother time. But needless to say, it didn't take me too long to get to the Abraham scene. And when I got through the Abraham scene, when I really got done with the book of Genesis, I distinctly remember thinking to myself, this is not what I expected. And it really seems like it's just a story about being a friend with God. And that Abraham and Sarah and Lot, they were just ordinary people. What made the story incredible, what made the story great, was the fact that God took such interest in such little people, and that God made a big deal out of such little people. And it started to dawn on me, this is the way of God. He makes a big deal out of little people. And if you're a little person and you understand yourself to be a little person, like everybody should, you're right on the doorstep of understanding God's concern and love for you. Okay, so Abe's big story begins, in chapter 12. The big moment or the big first action of Abraham is that there's a famine in the land. And so Abraham and Sarah, they go down into Egypt and they sojourn there because there's this famine. And when he goes into Egypt, he concocts this, little plan that, well, hey, Sarah, you're pretty good looking. And I don't want to be killed because the Pharaoh wants to take you into his harem. So just say you're my sister. Okay, so just say you're my sister, Sarah. That's a funny reference, but that's the storyline. And then Pharaoh does exactly that. He takes her into his harem, and then all of a sudden plagues start coming upon the Pharaoh, and a vision comes to Pharaoh that says, hey, stop this. These are my people. And Pharaoh comes to Abraham. He's like, you lied to me. Okay, so here we go. What do we get out of this first part of the story? Well, first of all, it's funny that Abraham and Sarah have no expectation that this God that has called them really isn't capable of taking care of their food in a famine or capable of protecting them. So they got to deviously or devise, we'll just say devise, not deviously, but just devise their own plan. And I love this story because Abraham's 75 and Sarah's 65. And apparently Sarah is still a looker at the age of 65. At least Abraham thinks so, and that is super sweet, right? And obviously Pharaoh thinks so as well. And that's why Pharaoh does take him in. And the poor pharaohs in this story, it's kind of pretty funny, right? Because if you read further in the story of Moses, you're going to find out that the poor pharaohs are always getting plagues poured upon them whenever they need to let God's people go. This Pharaoh complies quite quickly. He's like, hey, Abraham, you brought these plagues on me. Go, get out of here. Here's a bunch of stuff. Go. Now, the storyline is funny and it's fun-loving, and it could be anybody because, Abe and Sara are just kind of bumbling their way through life, and they don't have any real big expectations of this God who's just called them to leave their country. And so their worldview of God is pretty small, I think, at this point. But the big surprise, is that in this storyline, God is not actually disappointed with them. He doesn't, show any kind of anger. And it's even a bigger surprise if we take a step back and think about it, that God is personally interested in them, even though they're bumbling idiots. I mean, the tension for me in this story is that we want to say, come on, God, you're supposed to be doing big things. What are you doing messing around with this Abe and Sara? They're just a couple of hayseeds or a couple of... Who knows about Abe and Sara? They're not famous people. They're not extraordinary people. Come on, God, why would you be messing around with them? Well, here's why God would be messing around with them. Because friendship is his goal. He's making a friendship out of Abe and Sara. And like a good friend, God looks out for Abe and Sara even when the plans that they devise don't work out. And so that is the angle of this story that's going to keep on through to the very end. We come to a point where Abraham and Lot decide to part ways. In Genesis chapter 13, Abraham says to Lot, let there be no strife between you and me and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we're kinsmen. There's a big land out here. And he says, you take your pick, Lot. And Lot, lifted his eyes up and he saw that the Jordan Valley was really well watered, and he really liked it because it seemed like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. Parenthetically, we're told that this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now, you and I both know that this is not good. And you've been parenthetically kind of told that, the destruction of Sodom is around the bend. And this is where Lot has chosen to go. Now, and then we're told again, now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. And then the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look at the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward, for all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring can also be counted. Okay, so in this story, Abraham and Lot are going to make two really different choices. Abraham is already seen as someone who is, God-centered and fairly self-effacing. He just lets Lot make the decision. Lot, on the other hand, is pretty self-centered, and he's pretty spiritually careless because he's eyeballing the nicest plot of land, and he's also eyeballing Sodom, and he's saying, hey, that sounds like a fun place. And so we can conclude fairly quickly that Lot's choice is carnal, and it's carefree, and it's spiritually careless. And Abraham's choice, though, seems to be ground into trusting God and being selfless, being humble, that kind of thing. And God blesses Abraham's decision and reassures him of the promised land that he made to him. I also couldn't help but to note that when Lot did lift his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, I couldn't help but to wonder, it does seem like, Abraham has been filled in by God on the story of Adam and Eve. Maybe, right? Maybe even Cain, maybe even Noah. So they might be well aware of the beginning part of the story, like we're well aware and should be well aware of the beginning part of the story. But God blesses Abraham's decision, and he reassures him of the promises that he made to him. And this reassurance bit, where God keeps reassuring Abraham of the promises that he made to him, is just what a friend would do. It's what we expect from a friend. Okay, then Genesis chapter 14. Abraham rescues Lot. In Genesis chapter 14, there's apparently this war among the kings. And Abraham, he couldn't care less. Until in Genesis 14:14, Abraham heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, so he gathered up the trained men in his house, 318 of them, which tells us that Abraham's entourage is quite big. It's pretty healthy size. And he pursues them and he defeats them, and he brings back Lot and all of his possession and his women and his people, etc. So Abraham rescues Lot. And so here we have Abraham, I suppose, being kind of a hero warrior, sure, but it's quite different here because Abraham, as God's warrior, is really only a defender, and someone who protects his family. That's what rouses Abraham to be a warrior. He's brave because it's obvious that even having 318 fighting men, he has to devise a plan in the night to defeat the armies that are holding Lot, etc. And so he is a warrior, but he's a different kind of warrior. He's just a defender, and the Bible is always okay with just being a defender and protecting your family. There's no offense here. Abraham's not going on the offense. There's no rebellion here with Abraham. And the story gets even more interested than Abraham's victory. The story gets more interested in the warrior hero who is also spiritually admirable and recognized. And that's where we get Genesis 14:18. Melchizedek, the man of mystery, comes out onto the scene after the defeat of the kings. And this Melchizedek is the king of Salem. He brings out bread and wine, and he was, we're told, also a high priest of God Most High. And he blessed Abraham, and he said, "Blessed be Abraham, the most by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. Blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And so, Abraham is recognized by this very mysterious man, but it's kind of like God had said, those who bless you, I will bless, and there will be those who come out and bless Abraham. And this guy comes out, Melchizedek comes out and blesses Abram. But once again, this is probably the most glorious scene or the most rousing scene. And it's still pretty much on the nothing spectrum. There's nobody that recorded this scene except the Bible. And then in Genesis chapter 15, once again, the Lord intervenes to reassure that the promises that he made to Abraham are good. Like a good friend, God is just reassuring Abraham of the promises. God even proclaims that he would curse himself if he doesn't keep the promises that he has made to Abram. And that is just the tone of a good friend. God doesn't have to keep reassuring Abraham, but he does. He wants Abraham to be reassured, to be assured. Okay, so anyhow, we move on. The scene gets even more interesting in Genesis chapter 16. And in Genesis 16, Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar, though. And she devises this plan to, here's what seems to happen. We all should know that, Sarah decides to let Abram, have sex with Hagar and have a baby because, it seems like the thoughts of a son that God had promised to Abram are becoming a bit of an obsession with Sarah. And Sarah's plan revolves around that age-old idea that surely God must mean this. Even though he said this, he must mean this. Well, we're going to find out that that is some faulty thinking. And Hagar, her big, answer to this problem of not having kids, is going to have a surrogate kid. And Sarah's convinced that this will be a wonderful plan. Well, it immediately becomes a bad idea. Sarah immediately becomes jealous. Sarah immediately hates the plan. You have to laugh because Abram just simply went along with this plan. And once again, it's almost like Adam and Eve, right? I mean, who do you blame? Do you blame Eve for eating the forbidden fruit, or do you blame Adam for just standing by like a schmuck? And in this case, too, do you blame Sarah or do you blame, Abraham, who's just apparently standing around like a schmuck and says, oh, okay, if you want me to have sex with the sexy young Egyptian servant, then okay, whatever you say. But here's what's interesting. Even though this plan goes sideways very quickly, God smooths the waters. He smooths the waters of Sarah's bad plan. He's not angry. He seems to understand that her intentions were good, and God can actually cope with the messes here that Abraham and Sarah are making. And at this point, they are making messes as they go in this storyline of being friends with God. And so the point is very simple. This is a God that can cope with our messes too. If he can cope with the messes that Abraham and Sarah make, he can cope with the messes that we make. But we do got to understand that the consequences remain. And the consequences remain here for Sarah and Abraham too, because this sideways episode with Hagar, it's going to stay sideways. It's not going to get any better. Everybody becomes a bit of a loser in this episode. Nobody wins, but God does remain. And he remains very interested. He isn't going anywhere. This hasn't turned him off. He's not finicky or capricious like the world thinks that he is. And then in chapter 17, the promises are once again assured to Abraham. A covenant sign is given to him. Again, this is just the substance of someone trying to make a good friendship. And God is doing the heavy lifting here. He is constantly reassuring Abram that this thing is going to work out exactly the way he told. Abraham, is just totally human with God, as a friend would be. In Genesis chapter 17, verse 17, Abraham laughs. Abraham falls on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who's 100 years old? Sarah is 90 years old. Abraham laughs. But God, he can cope with that. He understands. It's funny. There's nobody that understands that this is funny more than God. I think when Abraham and Sarah laugh, it's kind of like laughter, but it's also kind of like, tears laughter and painful laughter. But anyhow, in Genesis chapter 18, Abraham and Sarah get 3 visitors. Abe and Sarah, upon getting these 3 visitors, demonstrate their hospitality skills, and turns out they're hospitality pros, which is not important, it doesn't seem, except that if you are a peasant, if you are a person of humble origins, especially living in the Middle East, especially in the ancient Middle East, you know how important hospitality is. And this is just a scene where Abe and Sarah demonstrating their hospitality to these, 3 strange visitors. Yes, they are strange. And just like we find out later in the new part of the Bible that you never know when you're going to entertain angels, so you always better be on your best game hospitality-wise, which is a message that runs through the whole Bible as well. Always be on your A game when it comes to hospitality, because you never know whenever you're entertaining angels. And in this case, these 3 men of mystery turn out to be God and 2 angels. Okay, in Genesis 18-9, these 3 visitors, are having conversation, pleasant conversation in the household, the tent of Abraham. And the episode gets super funny because Sarah is going to eavesdrop on a conversation. She's going to laugh herself, and she's going to try to BS God. Here's how the story goes. The visitors said to Abram, "Where's your wife Sarah?" "She's in the tent," Abraham said. The Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, is going to have a son." Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I'm worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is there anything that is too hard for the Lord?" "At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied it. She said, "I didn't laugh," for she was afraid. God said, "No, but you did laugh." Once again, God doesn't throw a hissy fit. God doesn't penalize Sarah. God understands more than anybody that this is funny and this is hard to believe. It's not as though God has, too high of expectations for Abe and Sarah here. He understands their frailties. He understands their trouble with the whole storyline, but he keeps reassuring them and he keeps sticking with them. And so this friendship with God is the only angle that you should be reading into. God is being extremely patient because he's interested in the friendship. And then this friendship deepens even more with Abram as these three strange visitors, who apparently is God and two angels. But in this deepening friendship with Abraham, God is also going to reveal to Abraham that Sodom and Gomorrah are going to be judged. I love this intimate line. The Lord said, and he's speaking to the two angels, I guess, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him?" The Lord said, "Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know." Genesis 18:22. So the men turned from there and turned towards Sodom, but Abraham stood before the Lord. Abraham drew near and said, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" God answered, "For the sake of 10, I would not destroy it." Now, I cut a bit out of there because there's this big bartering session that Abraham goes through with God. But I think the big thing here to see is that Abraham's relationship is deepening with God, and now God needs Abraham to understand judgment. And understanding judgment is part of the friendship that we have with God, that we do understand that judgment is necessary. And Abraham's going to understand that judgment is necessary. And Abraham's concern about judgment, are you going to, sweep away the righteous with the wicked, shows that he is a man of God's own heart. Abraham is learning that salvation is God's will, but judgment is real as well. You can't have one without the other. And Abraham is going to get a close-up look at the reality of judgment. And it turns out that there aren't 10 righteous in Sodom, and Sodom is indeed going to go by the way. Which brings us to Genesis 19. Sodom and Gomorrah are judged, and Lot's character is revealed once and for all. We don't have time to go into the story. The two angels come to Sodom in the evening. Lot was sitting by the gate. Lot sees them, and he rose to meet them, bowed his face to the earth. "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet, that you may rise up and go on your way." They said, No, we'll spend the night in the town square. And then the scene goes wild. The people of Sodom are nasty. They want to do nasty sexual things to these new visitors. And then Lot's character is really revealed in this too, because, Lot is of a strange character. He is biblically a man of faith. He'll later be called righteous Lot, which means that, the perspective of the Bible is that Lot was a man of faith, but he was a man of faith that nobody admires. In the story, chapter 19, Lot is even willing to give up his two daughters. So he knows that these visitors are very important, even maybe God's, visitors, and he sees how important they are. And he is so willing to give his two daughters over to be raped instead of these visitors. And so Lot's character is just revealed, that Lot is just really a man who seeks riches and is willing to align himself with the culture's demands, not godliness. And he ends up in the story being a caveman, by the way, which is pretty funny. And Lot demonstrates the kind of faith that nobody admires. And it's always a very, very sad thing to see the faithful getting sucked into depraved and ungodly culture. And it is possible to be a bad Christian, a bad person of faith. You can be hanging on there in a thread because God is so good that way. But Lot here is certainly nobody to be recognized. And then Lot's story gets even worse in 19 to 30. I won't, I'll spare you a little bit of the details. But, I'll just kind of summarize it in 19 to 30. As Lot has escaped Sodom. We find out that the two daughters, now that they're away from their hometown of Sodom, turns out maybe they wanted to be raped because they dastardly come up with a plan to get pregnant, and the only man they can find is their father. That they get drunk, and the next thing you know, they get pregnant, and that becomes the story of Moab and Ammon, which will become nemesis to the people of Israel. And so it turns out in this episode here that getting the family out of Sodom was not as difficult as getting Sodom out of the family, if you know what I mean. And this is just the Bible being very realistic of the, deplorable, depraved world that we live in. God saved Lot, saved his life for one reason. Abe's his friend. And Abraham was very concerned about Lot. That's why he was doing all the bargaining with Sodom to begin with. And God held his end of the bargain up, but some wonder if Lot was really worth saving. But Abe's his friend, and so he does save Lot. And okay. So the story continues. Genesis chapter 20. Abraham goes back down into another territory, and it's deja vu all over again. Sister Sarah must still be a looker, even at 100, because he's nervous that the king's going to take him into his harem, which that happens, and it's this kind of scene where you say, "Come on, Abe, you know better than this." And Abe still's relying on his old tricks, and God still fixes his messes. Like only a friend can do. Only a friend can look through your faults and still stay by your side. In Genesis chapter 20, it turns out that Abe and this Abimelech, the king that got sucked into this, that it's kind of a similar repeat story of Pharaoh. But turns out Abe and Abimelech turn out to be, friends, because Abimelech blesses Abraham and gets blessed himself. And then in Genesis chapter 21, we have the son that is born. His name is Isaac. And at the same time that Isaac is finally born, we see that God has kept his promise. And Sarah says, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abram and Sarah would nurse a child even at this late age? Unfortunately, though, Sarah and Hagar have not made amends, and Hagar and Ishmael must go. And so Sarah and Abe do kick Hagar and Ishmael out, but don't feel bad because God picks them up and promises that Ishmael will turn into a great nation, which he keeps that promise. And then in chapter 22, we see the test of all tests. God proposes the sacrifice of Isaac, the newborn son. And, Abraham goes along with that, but it's just a test. God's not going to participate in this kind of strangeness, but he does want to see if Abraham trusts God. And it turns out that he does trust God. Even under such crazy circumstances, Abraham simply puts his trust in God, but God certainly doesn't make him go through with it. And then in Genesis chapter 23, it's the end of Sister Sarah, and Abraham buys this burial plot. And the humor behind this story is that this land that Abraham is in is supposedly given to him by God, but he still has to pay a big price for the burial plot of his wife. And then in chapter 24, it's a very sweet story where Abraham keeps his duty, because this story, Abraham knows, is going to be through his son Isaac, and so he better find a bride for Isaac. And so chapter 24, super sweet love story. Again, no superheroes are emerging into the scene whatsoever. And then by the time we get to Genesis chapter 25, Abraham does take on some other wives and bears more sons. Is this his second or third wife? I think I would count Hagar as a second wife. And this wife, her name is Keturah. She bears him many sons, and hence the children's song, Father Abraham had many sons, which is actually looking to you and me as sons and daughters of Abraham. But nonetheless, in Genesis chapter 25, verse 7, there goes our hero. He's dead. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, at the age of 175. And in Genesis 25, we're also told the generations of Ishmael. God kept his promise to Ishmael. And sweetly, it's Ishmael and Isaac that bury their father next to their mother. And in Genesis chapter 25:19, Isaac is praying to the Lord because his wife is barren. The Lord grants his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceives a child. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is now going to continue the story on. And that's what the game plan was with Abraham, was to start a story of ordinary people and continue this story with ordinary people. And the Bible's story will always be about ordinary people. This is the God of the humble and the weak. Success and bravery are theirs and theirs alone. And as the story progresses, Israel itself, even as a nation, is a pretty humble picture of a nation. Nobody thinks that Israel is a huge threat throughout their own story. Israel's going to collapse as a nation. The Assyrians are going to deport the northern 10 tribes, and then the Babylonians are going to sack the southern 2 tribes. And Israel seems like a nothingness. But yet, Israel is carrying the story of God. And that's exactly the way God likes it, because the very final act of God's story is once again going to have the most humble of beginnings in the child that is going to be born of a woman, a peasant woman, and her husband, Mary and Joseph, the Christ child. This Christ child will not be a world sensation in his own lifetime, but through the humility and through the apparent weakness of this Jesus Christ, success will come. The final defeat of evil will be his in the cross. And this is exactly the way God puts a story together, because he wants to be friends with you, the ordinary. And the best thing for your life and my life is to build that mental image of a great friendship with God, who can cope with our messes, who can deal with us as long as we keep that trusting friendship with God.